In some ways, the threat today may be at its most heightened state since the attacks nearly 10 years ago.
That is Janet Napolitano testifying in front of the Homeland Security Committee of the House, Peter King's committee, yesterday. Went on to say that the greater threat now to the United States is homegrown radicalization, terrorism. And her colleague, Michael Leiter, who runs the National Counterterrorism Center, said that we have more to fear from Anwar al-Awlaki, the head of al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, based out of Yemen, than we do from Osama bin Laden. We thought this would be a good time to check in with James Carafano, who is the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and will also be joining us next Thursday when we take up Domestic Terrorism 101 with you and our forum. James, thanks for being with us, but this sounds like Domestic Terrorism 101 to me this morning.
Is any of this supposed to be news? I mean, look, come on. So we, at the Heritage Foundation, we actually track attempted terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11. We've been doing it for several years now.
Sure.
And when the new version of our paper comes out, the answer will be 36, which is, terrorist attacks that have been aimed at the U.S. or kill U.S. citizens since 9/11 that were thwarted. And when you go through that list, most of them are domestic in origin, and the number have been increasing in recent years. And look, on Obama's watch, we've had the underwear bomber and the Times Square bomber, which were two of the most serious ones, and were thwarted simply by luck. So none of this news is really surprising. In part, it's a reflection of the success of dealing with transnational terrorism, is that people like bin Laden are so desperate to stay in the game that they'll try anything, and basically they devolve to asking anybody anywhere to do anything just to show that they can pull something off.
But by the way, Jim, according to your own study, where does Nidal Hassan fall into that study? Because that attack was not thwarted, and he was clearly influenced by Anwar al-Awlaki.
Right. Yeah. And again, we only you can have a list of whatever you're looking for. What we were trying to highlight is, what makes us successful. So we've been focusing just on attacks that were thwarted. So it's everybody can count the number of successful attacks. There's 9/11 and there's the Fort Hood, which I think people tend not to pay attention to. Now naturally, I suppose, is when they hear on the news, okay, 10 guys are arrested for a horrible, terrible plot. Nobody paid attention if those 10 guys pulled off that plot, like the two guys, there were several guys in Fort Dix, New Jersey,
right,
that
yes,
planted to drive on post and shoot and kill people. Nobody remembers that because we arrested them. Mm-hmm. But if they'd done that and killed all those people, and of course the best way to deal with terrorist attacks is to stop them before they start. So we can't beat this drum enough, which is to say, look, you don't want to be doing Times Square bombings where you just got lucky and the guy didn't know how to make a bomb. You want to get out there and find them and stop them ahead of time. And this is a really important message when you think just this week you had House Republicans and Democrats vote against extending investigatory powers, which were specifically designed to go and stop terrorists.
But by the way, just going to that point, I meant to ask you this, and you brought it up yourself. Does that make us less safe from an investigative point of view, in your view, if this thing does not get reauthorized?
Yeah, there's 3 investigatory tools. 2 of them are in the Patriot Act. One of them is in the Intelligence Surveillance Act. They sunset, or in a sense,
yes,
law enforcement loses the authority to do them unless it's reauthorized. 2 of those, the ones from the Patriot Act, you can readily look at the number of investigations that we've had, which is seen where those tools are useful. So those are tools that are used all the time and are useful. The other one, which is the lone wolf provision, is something that the government says it hasn't used, but again, it's clearly a scenario that could very well happen, and so it's a tool that they might well need. And I explain to these people because a lot of people say, well, we're concerned about violations of civil liberties. Mm-hmm. Well, we know for a fact that all of these authorities are absolutely perfectly constitutional. So there's not a threat to civil liberty. Where there is a threat to some abuse is if law enforcement uses them imperfectly, if they don't use them appropriately. Well, the way you ensure that is you make sure people are trained, that you have proper oversight, that you have clear standards. So if you're not using the tools, if you don't have them, you don't have those things. So the worst thing would be to say, well, we'll wait till the next 9/11 and then we'll give these tools back to you. Well, then you're actually much more likely to have abuses because people won't know how to use them properly.
We know that Al-Qaeda and guys like Anwar al-Awlaki are using the internet for, trying to plan and put seeds in the minds of Americans here. Are we, and by we I mean, the American government, the FBI, and other agencies like them, are we using the internet in a way to try and thwart that? I mean, who's the net positive, net negative in that battle?
Boy, I'll tell you, that is a really, really great question, and you hit on a really solid point. The number one threat to the internet from terrorism is terrorist exploitation of the internet. They use it for everything from propaganda to fundraising to coordinating operations. The guys that did the Mumbai terrorist attack used Google Earth to scout out their targets.
Right.
And our government, there's a lot of people out there that know that, both in the government and actually in the private sector, and NGOs who are on the internet looking for terrorist activity. In some ways, the terrorist chatter has actually been a great enabler in terms of finding and taking down operations. When you go on an internet chat room today and you start chatting with a fellow extremist, you're as likely to be talking to an FBI informant as you are to a fellow terrorist. Now, the terrorists know that we're out there looking for them, and, we play this cat and mouse game going back and forth. So, for example, there's a new technique called a dead letter drop, an email dead letter drop. So you send an email, the NSA could well read that. So what they do is they set up an email account, they type a draft email, and then they sign off. And then what happens is the other guy, he signs onto the account, goes into the draft file, reads the email, and then deletes it. So the email's never actually sent across the internet. So it's less likely to be intercepted.
But I also look at what Egypt and Iran. I mean, we saw what Twitter and Facebook has done in those two countries, and to me, it's kind of that's the way we should be approaching it, trying to push those things on other countries, especially.
A lot of what they use the internet for is surveillance and finding these things and going down. There are people and that go around the world, private citizens, that look for these things and conduct their own denial of service attacks on websites and then shut them down or flood them out. So there is this kind of silent cyber war going back and forth between the forces of good and the forces of evil online.
Let me go to something low tech, but was brought up at the hearings yesterday in front of Peter King, and it's coincidental, I suppose, that yesterday's hearing is followed by our forum on domestic terrorism, which will supposedly be followed by Peter King's very controversial hearings on supposedly the radicalization of American Muslims. But yesterday, it was brought up by Congressman Paul Brown about whether or not there should be a form of profiling at airports as opposed to what the Secretary calls random searches. And she was defending random searches, saying it has to be truly random, otherwise you lose the value of unpredictability. What do you think the future of random searches is going to be if we know more and more that people like Anwar al-Awlaki are actually recruiting and looking for American Muslims to carry out these acts?
Well, you actually need a bit of both, and in truth, and in practice, TSA does a bit of both. I mean, random searches are important because, terrorists like predictability. They like to know the security that they're going to face going through, and if they can figure out, what the profile is you're looking for, then in a sense, they get a get-out-of-jail-free card. They just make sure their agent, doesn't have that. I was talking to a woman yesterday, and she goes, look, I went through security, and everybody there, they were old people like me because we all had artificial hips, right? And, so if they said, well, why are we looking at that? Well, then, you could conceive where they would just find somebody, an old person with an artificial hip. TSA is doing what's called, behavioral profiling, which is, maybe profiling is not the right word, is they're looking for people that of a suspicious nature. And they've been training agents on this technique. They've been integrating that in the airports for a while. So they do a bit of both of these. I think, and this may be a little frustrating for the flying public, and I'm not always sympathetic with TSA because people make some stupid decisions sometimes. But and I'm not actually confident that we're going to keep going down this road, and I'll explain that. But what TSA has been doing is decentralizing, giving the people, local people, more autonomy in terms of executing the security procedures so they can adapt to the situation that they're facing. Because if you just standardize thing and everybody will do this, well, from one say, well, it's great for the airport passenger because they know exactly what's going to happen, but then that's also good for the terrorists. They know how to get around that. What I'm very, very concerned about is this decision by the TSA administrator to let the TSA have collective bargaining rights and to have a union. Because now what I'm very, very fearful of is we're going to wind up in this thing about unions versus the government, and what we're going to lose out is it the best security procedure, or is it just the one the union likes?
We have to leave it, but I hope you expand on that at the forum next week, because that's an important point. A lot of people don't know about it.
I think this is a big, big mistake. You know, we were saying yesterday, this woman, that's why I love going out and talking to people. She was saying, look, I figured out how to get out of this. She goes, all I do is cry now. When they cry, they leave me alone.
Right. Okay. We'll leave it there, Jim. Thanks very much for coming on the show. We'll talk to you on Thursday night. We appreciate it as always.